Hello and welcome to episode 17 of the How to Make Any Game Mechanic series. If you're new around here, in each episode we randomly choose a viewer's game mechanic suggestion and I try and create it in real time. As a disclaimer, because everything is done in real time, it may not be the greatest method to create this mechanic, so take everything you see here with a grain of salt. With that being said, if you were following along and run into any hiccups along the way, there's a link for the GitHub of this project in the description box below, which contains each and every episode. So after giving the wheel a spin, today's suggestion comes from Aimbot, who suggested game saving and loading. This is an absolutely great suggestion, and something I know most beginners, including myself when I first started, struggle with. So with that being said, let's head on over to Unity. Inside of Unity, I created a new folder called Episode 17 and a new scene called Episode 17. We are inside that blank scene now. I can already tell that this episode is going to be just a little bit different, as I won't be featuring something flashy and exciting like the 2D grenade, for example. But although maybe a little bit underrated, saving and loading is an absolutely crucial mechanic for most modern games. With that being said, when I first started using Unity, saving and loading from something like a Json just seemed like some overwhelming task. So if you fall into the exact same category, let me put your mind at ease. Yes, we will be going over Json saving, but first I will go over a few alternative methods of having persistent data, and then we'll just slowly build up to more complex methods as the video progresses. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's create a new empty object, and let's just call it save load system. I'm just going to reset the transform, although not completely necessary, and then we can make a new script. So I'm just going to call this script save load system. And with that new script created, let's click on our empty game object and let's just drag the script on. We can then feel free to open that script up in VS Code. So in this episode, I'm thinking we're probably going to cover 3 different types of saving data. The first one being a static variable. We'll then move on to something like Prefs and then finally Json. So if you're used to any of those methods or you just want to see one in particular, feel free to scrub the video and just select whatever one you want. Personally, I think beginners would benefit from seeing all of them, but don't worry, I'm not going to get offended if you want to skip over one or the other. So let's start out with the static variable. So in my variable declaration, I'm going to create a public static int, and we can just call it my static data. If you've never used a public static variable is accessible in any script across all of your scenes. So how would we use this to save data? Well, it's actually kind of a trick question. Unfortunately, public static variables don't actually save when the application is closed, but if you need to transfer data from one scene to another, like let's say a high score for example, this might just be a good solution. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's go over this example. So in our start method, I'm just going to say something like my static data is going to be equal to, let's just say 10. From there, we're going to load a new scene and just debug that static variable. So in order to do that, let's go up to the top of our script and let's say using Unity engine.scene management. We can then scroll down back to our start method and we can just say scene manager.load scene, and I'm just going to load the previous episode. So let's just say episode 16. We can then save this up, and I'm actually going to open up the picture script from that episode. I'm inside the picture script, and the only reason I'm in this script is just to debug that variable we just created. This is the only script in that episode, so I'm kind of forced to do it in here. So inside of start, I'm just going to write a debug.log, and I'm just going to say save load system.myStaticData. And this is just going to debug.log that value into the console. We can then save this up and let's head back into Unity. I am back in Unity, and before I hit play, because we're going to be transferring scenes, we actually need to include it in our build settings. So File, Build Settings, and then I'm just going to select the episode 16 folder and drag that scene into the settings. I can then exit out of the settings, and then we can go back into our 17 folder, and I'm just going to hit play. I have hit play and our scene has switched, and sure enough, our debug.log has debugged that 10 value. So there you have it, the my static data has saved across scenes and we could access it inside this scene if we needed to. While we have had persistent data transfer our scenes, this is not exactly optimal, and as already stated, if we exited out of the application, that data would not be saved. So let's go ahead and create another example in our save load system script that addresses all of those issues. So inside our save load script, I'm going to go ahead and create a new variable. I'm going to create a private int myPrefData. And this variable is going to be used for our player prefs, which is just another form of saving. I no longer want to switch scenes, so I'm just going to comment out this line, and we can assign myPrefData a value. So myPrefData, and we can just make it equal to 20. We can then go ahead and create some functions, and I'm actually going to hook them up to buttons as soon as we're done inside of here. So let's make a couple of public functions. So I'm going to make a public void save pref data, and I'm also going to go ahead and make a public void load pref data. So let's go into our save pref data function, and inside we can go ahead and start setting up our player pref. So what we're going to do is say player prefs dot set int, as we made an int variable, and inside we need two things. We need a key, which is going to reference our save data, and we need the value we want to set. If you have not created a key inside this player pref data, one will automatically be created when you set the value for the first time. So inside, let's create our key, and this string could be anything that you want it to be called. For our example, I'm just going to call it pref data. Then inside, we need to set the value, which is just going to be myPrefData. Hopefully all of that makes sense so far. So basically, we're just creating a key called prefData, and then setting our prefData to be the myPrefData variable we created at the top of our script. For our load prefData function, let's go ahead and say myPrefData is going to be equal to playerprefs.getInt. And inside, we just need to reference a key that we have created. So in our example, we created a key called prefData. And that's it, our variable will now be equal to whatever we set that key, effectively loading the data stored and storing it into our variable. We can then just make sure everything is working as intended by debug.log. And inside, we're just going to reference our myPrefData variable. And that's it, that's all we have to do to get player prefs working in our project. Let's go ahead and head back into Unity and set up some buttons that will call those functions. So inside of Unity, let's create a new, and let's create a UI canvas. And then for the render mode, I'm just going to put a screen space camera, drag our camera into the slot, and then we can start setting up our buttons. I'm going to right click on our canvas, make a new UI button, and we can call this button save data. And then for the button's text, I'm just going to make sure it says save pref. I'm then going to go ahead and duplicate this button, and we can call it load data. And then for the text of this button, it's just going to say load pref. We can then click on our save data button, scroll down to the bottom, and click the plus icon on our onClick function. We can then drag and drop our save load system into the slot, select a function from our save load system, and it will be save pref data. Let's do the exact same thing for our load data button. So click the plus, drag and drop our save load system into the slot, select our save load script, and then load pref data. I'm then just going to move these and position them somewhere up at the top of our scene. So something like this would be fine. I'm also just going to scale these up as I notice they're a little bit small. And that's it, we now have two buttons that will load our functions. I'm just going to make sure everything looks good in the game view, and I'm going to change our background from this awful blue color. So background type, solid color, this nice gray color. And then we can hit play and make sure everything is working as intended. So I hit play, and I'm going to hit our save pref button. And then I'm going to click our load pref button, and if everything went accordingly, we should get a debug.log of 20. And sure enough, we get our 20 in our console. We just successfully loaded our data. And the best thing about this method is we can uncheck play, click it again, I have clear on play for our console, and then when I hit the load pref button, R20 comes up. So not only will this data persist across scenes, it will persist even when you exit and reopen the application. So if we can save and load data this easily, what's the need for a JSON file? Well, I'm glad you asked. The reason we're not going to want to use this method in a professional setting is because this method is actually very easy to hack into. It is not protected whatsoever, and those values can be changed very easily. When using a JSON, for example, we can encrypt and decrypt the contents of the file, making it nearly illegible to anyone who's trying to peek inside. So what are player prefs for then? Well, player prefs are exactly what they sound like, player preferences. They're used for things like settings menus, where you would be changing the mouse sensitivity, maybe even keybinds, and just things of that nature. Things that don't have to be on absolute lockdown. However, if you're making an indie game and you really don't care if your players hack into your game, using something like player prefs to save all of your data isn't really that bad. I mean, I know I'm definitely guilty when I was first starting using Unity. Ideally though, you would want to transfer over to a JSON file where we'll go over how to save more complex data types to properly and securely save your data. So let's open up our save load script and let's start playing around with our JSON file. So to get started with our JSON file saving and loading, I think it'd be a good idea to use a more realistic example. So let's scroll down to the bottom of our script and we're going to create a new class. We're going to need to include a system.serializable attribute, so let's create that now. So system.serializable, and then we can make a public class save data. Inside this class, I said we wanted to do a more realistic example. So let's go ahead and make a public int, and let's just make a health variable. This would be the health of your player for whatever game you're working on. You could also go ahead and expand this further by including stats or anything else you want to save, but for now we'll just stick with this one health variable. So with our class now created, let's scroll up to the top of our script, and we're going to need to make a variable from our class type. So let's make a private save data, and we can just call it my JSON data. We're also going to need to initialize our variable, so equals new save data. So inside of start, let's go ahead and let's set our health value. So my JSON data dot health is going to be equal to 20. We can then go ahead and create a couple of functions, but before that, let's just get rid of our update function as not to confuse ourselves. So with our update function now removed, let's make a new public void, and let's say save JSON data, and then we can make another function, public void load JSON data. So let's start with saving our data. In order to start saving and loading our data, we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need the data we want to save, and we're also going to need a file path to where we are saving it. That seems fairly straightforward to me. So let's go ahead and let's start with a string data. Because this is a JSON, which is effectively just a notepad file, all of our data is going to need to be converted into a string. So we're going to make our data equal to JSON utility dot to JSON, and inside we're going to put our data, which is just my JSON data. So this would be everything like your health, your stats, or anything else that we put in that class earlier. From here we now need a file path, so string file path is going to be equal to application dot persistent data path, and we're going to need to be able to index what our JSON file is. So let's scroll back up to the top of our script and let's make a private const string, and we can call it JSON file name. And then we're just going to make it equal to /JSON data .json. And this is what we're going to be calling our JSON file. You could have named it anything you wanted, but you do need to include the slash and the .json. So now that we have our file name, let's scroll back down to where we have our file path, and let's just add it on to the end of our file path. So our JSON file name. While we're here, we might as well make things easier and debug.log our file path. We can then write the data to that file. So system.input_output.file.write all text. And then we need where we're writing it to and the data we are writing. So the file path and then the data. Hopefully I haven't lost you just yet. I promise this is actually as hard as it's going to get. From here, let's make another debug.log and we can just say save created. And with that, before we get on to the loading, let's just save this up and let's head back into Unity. So back in Unity, I'm going to right click on the canvas and create a new empty object. And I'm just going to call this Pref buttons. I'm then just going to take my save and load data buttons and just make them a child of that Pref buttons game object. I'm then just going to duplicate that object and then just move the save and load data off to the other side. I'm going to rename this instead of Pref buttons to be Json buttons. And then for the save and load data, we can rename the text instead of save Pref, save Json. And instead of load Pref, load Json. I'm then going to click on the Save Data button, scroll down, and make sure we are using the Save Load System, Save JSON Data, and then just do the exact same thing for the load. So Save Load System, Load JSON Data. And there, that's it. Our Save JSON and Load JSON buttons are actually going to save and load from the JSON. We can then go ahead and we can hit play. So during runtime, I'm just going to go ahead and click that Save JSON button. And sure enough, we get our file path and we get the debug.log that the save was actually created. I'm just going to copy and paste where this file is being saved. So inside my file explorer, here is the persistent data and then the JSON data we created. We can open that up and you can see health is set to 20. Now what we can do is exit out of all of this. And when we hit this load JSON button, we need to read from that text file and set our save data to be the value of whatever is inside that file. So back in our save load system, let's move on to the load JSON data function. So what we need to load our data is probably where the file is saved to. So the file path, and then we're going to have to extract our data and then assign it to our variable. So let's start with our file path. What we can actually do is just copy and paste this line of code from our save JSON data. So the file path is going to be the exact same, and then we can move on to the data. So string data is going to be equal to system.input_output.file.read all text. So very much like how we written all the text, we are now going to read all the text, and then we can just read it from the file path. And now that we have access to that data and we have it stored as a string, we can just say my JSON data is equal to JSON utility.fromJSON, so the opposite of toJSON. And you need to assign a variable type, and our variable type is save data, which is the type of the variable we created. And then we need two brackets, and inside we're going to extract it from the data string. And that's it. We have now just found our data and saved it back into our my JSON data variable. We can then go ahead and just debug.log my JSON data.health. And if everything went perfectly, we should see the number 20 in our console. So let's go ahead and let's save this up and let's head back into Unity. So back in Unity, let's go ahead and let's hit play. So rather than clicking the save and load buttons, we actually already have the file saved, and it still says health 20, so we could easily just load that data. But to make you feel just a little bit better, we can click that save JSON button, and then we can load from the JSON, and now we have the value 20. So everything's working as we expected it to. And I think that's where we're going to leave this episode off. I really hope you enjoyed today's video and maybe even learned something. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.